In 2012, Naomi Holford from the Cardiff University School of Social Sciences published her thesis, Making Classed Sexualities, investigating gender, power and violence in middle-class teenagers' relationship cultures. In the paper, Holford acknowledged the help of Emma Renold.
First of all, enormous thanks go to my supervisors, Emma Renold and Amanda Robinson, who provided invaluable intellectual guidance, support, and unfailing patience through the ups and downs, and never gave up on me.
In the paper, Holford writes,
Gender is taken for granted in popular discourse, largely viewed as natural and unproblematic, yet simultaneously the subject of fascination. Many newspaper column inches and popular books are taken up by discovering the essential differences between men and women and speculating on these differences. But the question of what gender is remains a non-issue. One is considered to be either a man or a woman. This essence follows from and is dependent upon biological sex, which is determined at or before birth, and places you into one of two categories. Yet theorists of gender over the past decades have taken issue with these common sense views, developing concepts of gender as socially constructed, not as something inherent to the self, pre-existing society, but as something that is constantly produced in interaction. Its relation to the body, to culture, place, class, race, age, history, institutions, other people, sexuality, are all implicated in the production of meanings by which gender comes to be read as natural. The term gender has largely taken the place of, or become a synonym for, sex in popular discourse in recent years, merely used as a shortcut to describing a person's position as male or female, or the distinctions between men and women. However, its usage in academic discourse has previously been intended precisely to trouble that link between biological sex and social mechanisms. Gail Rubin coined the phrase, the sex-gender system, defining this as the set of arrangements by which a society transforms biological sexuality into products of human activity, and in which these transformed sexual needs are satisfied. The decoupling of gender and what have been termed as gender roles from the biological division of sex allowed for the analysis of differences, relations, and hierarchies based on gender. This has not, though, always led to a significant change in perception. Christine Delphi criticizes what she sees as a continued tendency to think of gender in terms of sex, to see it as a social dichotomy determined by a natural dichotomy, seeing gender as the content with sex as the container. She takes issue with the idea that sex causes gender, suggesting instead that gender precedes sex, that is, that sex, assigned as a dichotomous classification and envisaged as a natural biological trait, is a sign required to mark out the gender hierarchy in society. Hierarchy precedes and engenders the division into male and female. One of the most influential recent gender theorists has been Judith Butler, whose work is situated within a more literary philosophical paradigm, but has had resonance throughout the social sciences for its radical rethinking of the nature of gender. She argues that gender is something that is done, not something that exists. Centrally, for Butler, identities do not pre-exist actions. Rather, gender is constituted through a series of performances through which the subject makes and reiterates his/her gender. There is no true self behind these.
Holford would go on to become a lecturer in childhood and youth studies at the Open University. In 2021, an article of hers was published on the Open University website. The article is titled, Supporting Young Trans People's Rights to Health and Happiness. Holford argued against the original Supreme Court decision in the Kira Bell case that children under 16 were not capable of consenting to puberty blockers. She described Ellen, now Elliot Page, as someone who had found their authentic self. In a recording for the American Civil Liberties Union, Page explains the message that she would give to her younger self.
My message to my younger self would just be like, you know who you are, and please embrace that. I feel for me, I understood my truth. I felt it very strongly, and it was all of these external forces and noises that pushed and pulled and made me sort of lose track of who I was. And so I guess to my younger self, I'd say, that discomfort and that pain you're feeling, that is not yours, that is theirs. And to just keep going on the journey of embracing who you truly are. And that's what's going to lead you to happiness.
Holford wrote,
Research with children and young people indicates that many are increasingly viewing gender as fluid and open. At the same time, they are still constrained and restricted by gender roles and expectations, particularly by school structures. A society that is more accepting of trans and non-binary lives is open to wider possibilities for all children. This article has focused on treatment for gender dysphoria, the deep feeling that your gender is wrong. But many trans and non-binary people also talk about gender euphoria, the feeling of joy when your gender finally feels right. For some, this may require hormonal or other medical intervention. All young people deserve the opportunity to explore their identities and find the self that is right for them.
The article was subject to criticism by activist group Object Now, who wrote a letter of complaint to the Vice-Chancellor. No action was taken. In the same year, Professor Joe Phoenix was involved in setting up the Open University Gender Critical Research Network. A fellow founding member of the network, philosophy professor Jon Pike, explained what gender critical means to him.
So, Jon, could you help us understand a little bit, please?
Yes, I'll say what it means to me, and this is up for contestation, of course. So there's a very boring sense that I'll start with, in which gender criticality or being gender critical just means being critical of gender stereotypes, and this is a sense in which it's kind of widespread in social theory and social policy and on the political left, if you like, and that's where I come from, and so I'm critical of gender stereotypes. So there you go. But virtually everyone would say, would buy into that, the idea that, there are certain ways in which you have to behave to properly be a man and properly be a woman. So that's general, and I think I've got nothing, hugely interesting to say about that. There is a big issue in, if you like, the philosophy and metaphysics of gender, what gender identity is, and whether there is this kind of the nature of the identity posit, what the idea that there is some kind of essential identity that we have, sometimes that we're born with, sometimes the claim that you just know it intimately and immediately, and that causes problems for people like me who just say, I don't have this sense of gender identity. I know I'm male, but what is there beyond that? And then there are issues. So my big kind of research area is sport, and gender critical views in sport seem to me to be roughly right and say, look, it's sexed bodies that matter for sport.
The network is highly controversial. Holford was one of 368 signatories of an open letter from Open University academic staff protesting its formation. The letter stated,
"We, the undersigned Open University faculty and staff, write to express our profound disappointment and concern at the recent launching of the Gender Critical Research Network as a special interest group within the health and well-being strategic research area, which is being hosted on official Open University channels. Gender critical feminism is a strand of thought and a belief that is fundamentally hostile to the rights of trans, non-binary and genderqueer people. It is in this context that we write to express our concerns and to reaffirm our commitment to our trans, non-binary and gender non-conforming students and colleagues. We are concerned that the Open University's decision to approve and promote this network is in conflict with its obligations under the Equality Act 2010, and particularly the public sector equality duty regarding gender reassignment. The recent Employment Appeal Tribunal, Maya Forstater versus CGD Europe and others, confirmed that gender-critical views are a protected belief. However, the Employment Appeal Tribunal also highlighted that manifesting gender-critical beliefs by misgendering or harassing people in a context covered by the Equality Act, such as the workplace, would likely amount to unlawful discrimination. We are concerned to see that the Gender Critical Research Network is already using Open University platforms to circulate prejudicial statements. The Open University's mission is to make higher education open to all, as well as promoting social justice and equality, as acknowledged in recent Pride statements, which affirm the Open University's support of LGBTQ+ staff and students. Furthermore, the Open University's gender identity policy and guidance states that staff have a responsibility to respect the dignity of all students and their self-identified gender status, and that Open University students should be able to study in an environment free from discrimination, harassment, and victimization, in a place where everyone is treated with dignity and respect. We believe that the Open University has a duty of care towards its trans, non-binary and gender non-conforming students and staff, and that the Gender Critical Research Network directly impedes this duty. We stand opposed to the backing of this network by the Open University, including the use of official Open University social media platforms, Open University branding, and the alignment of this network with the health and well-being strategic research area. We do not believe that freedom of speech or academic freedom should come at the expense of marginalized groups, such as those possessing protected characteristics under the law. This includes honouring commitments made in the Open University Statement of Principles on Academic Freedom to take action to avoid hostility, degradation and harm. For instance, in promoting ideas, we will make every reasonable effort to minimise the risks of any harm, either physical or psychological, arising for any person, institution or community. We call on the Open University's Vice-Chancellor's executive team to take the following actions. Number 1, to withdraw its public support for and affiliation with the Gender Critical Research Network. 2, to affirm their position as a trans-inclusive employer. 3, to commit to developing a concrete plan of action for supporting and affirming trans students and staff in this trans-hostile external and internal environment.
Joe Phoenix resigned from the Open University and subsequently won a case for indirect discrimination. In her witness statement to the Employment Tribunal, she stated,
Stonewall, I believe, is central to the recent strand of thought which has gained traction in certain institutions and sections of society, including universities. This is the belief that gender identity is always more important than biological sex, and that it is gender identity, not biological sex, that determines whether someone is a man or a woman. Stonewall defines gender identity as a person's innate sense of their own gender, whether male, female, or something else. See non-binary below, which may or may not correspond to the sex assigned at birth. Stonewall defines gender as, often expressed in terms of masculinity and femininity, gender is largely culturally determined and is assumed from the sex assigned at birth. Stonewall's definition of a transgender woman is someone who is assigned male at birth but identifies and lives as a woman. This may be shorted to trans woman or MTF, an abbreviation of male to female. Stonewall's definition of a trans man is the same, but in reverse. Stonewall championed the slogan, "Trans women are women," and, although to a lesser extent, "Trans men are men," which encapsulates the belief that it is someone's gender identity, not their biological sex, which makes them a man or a woman. This slogan, "Trans women are women, get over it," invoked Stonewall's famous slogan, "Some people are gay, get over it," suggesting that those who disagree that trans women are literally women are prejudiced in the same way as those who think that homosexuality is wrong. In an interview on BBC Radio 4's Woman's Hour on the 18th of November 2021 with Nancy Kelley, then CEO of Stonewall, there was the following exchange. Host, do you believe that literally or metaphorically that trans women are women? Nancy Kelley, literally. The belief that it is not biological sex but gender identity, and whether one lives as a man or woman, that determines whether you are a man or a woman, leads, as a matter of logic, to certain conclusions. These conclusions include the view that it is wrong to exclude trans women from any spaces or services or sports reserved for women, in the same way that it would be wrong to exclude any other type of woman, for example, disabled women or black women. In August 2015, Stonewall submitted written evidence to the Women and Equality Select Committee inquiry on transgender equality. In it, Stonewall supported an end to provisions in the Equality Act, which allow for single-sex spaces and sport. Stonewall's website summarises their submission to the parliamentary inquiry. A review of the Equality Act 2010 to include gender identity rather than gender reassignment as a protected characteristic, and to remove exemptions, such as access to single-sex spaces. A further example of the logical consequences of the belief that trans women are literally women is Nancy Kelley's response to a BBC investigative piece about how some lesbians are being pressured to have sex with trans women. The Stonewall CEO compared lesbians, who do not want to have sex with trans women, to not wanting to date people of colour, fat people, or disabled people. Sexuality is personal and something which is unique to each of us. There is no right way to be a lesbian, and only we can know who we're attracted to. Nobody should ever be pressured into dating, or pressured into dating people they aren't attracted to. But if you find that when dating, you are writing off entire groups of people, like people of colour, fat people, disabled people, or trans people, then it's worth considering how societal prejudices may have shaped your attractions. We know that prejudice is still common in the LGBT+ community, and it's important that we can talk about that openly and honestly. In other words, a lesbian stating that she is same-sex attracted and so won't date trans women because they are male is a form of prejudice akin to racism, according to the former CEO of Stonewall. It is worth stressing here that the available evidence suggests that most trans women have a penis. Stonewall itself stresses in its Truth About Trans section of its website that you do not need to have had any surgery or medical intervention to be trans. It's important to remember that being trans isn't about having a particular appearance or particular body parts. It's something that's absolutely core to a trans person's identity and doesn't alter whatever their outward appearance might be. Some people who believe that gender identity should always trump biological sex label transphobic, those of us who believe in sex-based rights for women. it is common for individuals and for groups who seek to promote, or even simply to analyse, sexed bodies and sex-based rights, such as single-sex spaces, to face protests, calls for cancellation and threats of violence, all because these views and discussions are deemed to be transphobic.
The Welsh Government have given over £1 million of public money to Stonewall since 2015. In April 2024, the Cardiff Academic Freedom Association was launched with the goal of promoting academic freedom and freedom of speech at Cardiff University. Jo Phoenix was invited to speak at the inaugural meeting. She said,
I suggest that over the last 2 or 3 decades, there has been produced in universities a culture of acquiescence, a culture of silence and conformity, alongside a culture in which the difference between politics and academic knowledge production has collapsed. And this culture has its roots in marketisation of universities. The sector-wide structural changes in which universities now have to compete against each other for the dwindling funds on offer mean that, as academics, we are all individually and collectively weighed up and measured in relation to our contributions to a ridiculous set of neoliberal audits. I have witnessed firsthand how young academics fall prey to groupthink, are afraid to dissent from orthodoxy and end up acquiescing to the audit processes and procedures in which they club their knowledge claims for fear of reprisal, which of course ends up meaning that they rarely break out of their own echo chambers. One culprit in this production of acquiescence is, in my mind, the demand that we produce impactful research. In disciplines such as my own, that means getting involved in politics, getting onto and active in social media, and pushing for changes to law and policy. Don't get me wrong. I believe that as academics, we have a professional duty to be publicly engaged, but public engagement is a different activity to producing impact and evidence of impact. For, if nothing else, producing impact requires us to engage in a very different type of intellectual exercise. Politics requires us to pronounce, this is how the world really is, and mentally and publicly dispose of the inconvenient facts or attitude of doubt and questioning. And this is what you, government, organisations, must do. Knowledge production, on the other hand, is exactly the opposite. It requires us to question, to open up the space for doubt, to challenge the conditions of existence of our own knowledge. And academics who have entered the profession since REF 2014 are more and more searching for impact, just as funders are making it easier to get impact acceleration grants rather than grants to produce new knowledge and do primary research. Combined with that, the drive for world-leading, paradigm-shifting publications forces many young academics to think that if they create new brand name versions of their discipline alongside greater and greater impact, they are doing their job. It turns academics into marketeers and seekers of celebrity, and all of this leads to both the distorting of academic values and ideal, as well as an inevitable narrowing of academic diversity. It generates the conditions in which some viewpoints become seen as heresy, and some academics seek their impact through denunciation of heretics and heretical policies. How to end? I am not convinced that we are diagnosing the problem in universities correctly. There is a crisis in academic freedom, to be sure, caused by implementation of Stonewall law, but I think it is also a symptom of a wider crisis in academia, generated at least in part by neoliberal marketisation of universities, alongside another deep crisis of university leadership. The dimensions of that crisis were played out for all to see today when the Russell Group Submission tweeted its submission to the Office for Students consultation about how to protect academic freedom in the new Freedom of Speech Act 2024. They asked the OFS to include examples of unlawful speech which universities would be expected to take steps to restrict, including anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, or gender-critical speech in the guidance. When their colossal error was pointed out to them, they publicly apologized and changed gender-critical speech to transphobia. The issue for me is that this submission and the swapping of the terms denotes a fundamental legal illiteracy and failure to understand legal harassment. For case after case, mine included, has demonstrated conclusively that gender-critical speech is not transphobic. But if university leaders understood the law and case law on bullying and harassment, we may not be in quite the state we are, presuming, of course, that there are more university leaders who are prepared to stand up against the bullies and the campaigns to denounce those that they disagree with.
Cardiff University refused to pay for the security costs for the event. In a blog post on the Cardiff University website from 2024, Lydia writes,
Stonewall champions beyond the badge. As Cardiff's status as a Stonewall diversity champion shines on, our commitment to LGBT plus inclusion scales new heights in 2024. Fresh from the insights of Stonewall's London Workplace Conference, where Europe's brightest converged to redefine workplace inclusivity, we carry back actionable knowledge and network-driven momentum. Securing a top spot among universities in the Workplace Equality Index is not where we stop, it's where we leap forward. This year, we're not just listed, we're active participants in shaping the future of LGBT plus advocacy, drawing from the latest best practices and transformative ideas discussed among thought leaders and change makers. Cardiff stands as a beacon, not just for today's students, but as a herald for tomorrow's inclusive future.